Happy Thanksgiving. This is one of my first going live online, and I admit to being a little bit nervous because of what I'm going to say today. But it's been almost a week where I have been woken up in the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the morning, with this on my heart and having a feeling that I really need to share a little bit of our story. And it's been so strong that I couldn't sleep. So I thought I'm going to get up and say this morning, and I kept putting it off, but I need to go to town. So I thought I'm going to do it because I'm always telling people do things scared. So, some of you have known me for many years, and some of you know a little bit of what we went through as a family. Some of you I've just been friends with in the last year or two. But it doesn't matter. I want to share with you a little bit of what a lot of people don't know. So when Kevin, which is our youngest, was about 2.5 years old, our daughter, Tori, was diagnosed with leukemia. And it was an absolute shock. So that kind of threw our lives into turmoil, as cancer often does. And at first the doctor had said to us, hey, we think it's just localized. Her diagnosis was first lymphoma, but he said, you know what, we're going to do a bone scan to see if there's just anything in the bone, but we're pretty much sure with how our blood work looks and everything that it's just local. Well, I remember I was nursing Kevin because he was maybe 3 weeks old, not quite, when the doctor came back in and said, we're very surprised, but your daughter, actually, her bone marrow is 80% cancerous. So they changed her diagnosis to leukemia. So I remember just sitting there, after you have a baby, your hormones are all over anyways, but that really took us for a spin. So I remember a mother said to me, she said, you're going to get your cancer fee, don't worry. And eventually you do, though. It definitely takes you for a spin. So we had gone 6 months into the treatment, and the week before she had just been diagnosed with, just gone through the harshest chemo like that they do kind of in cycles. And we were making maple syrup one day, and the brick that the pan was sitting on broke, and the boiling sap went over her and my son Derek. So I just remember my husband running to the house, and I looked out because he was hollering. I thought, what's going on? And he was trying to get the clothes off of Derek. So I grabbed Tori, but her body had started swelling so bad from the burns that I had to cut her out of her clothes. Sorry. And so we called the ambulance, and they came actually pretty quickly. But our neighbor, it was a God thing, she had a scanner. And she heard the police and the ambulance coming, so she came over and turned off our barbecue. And yeah, there's just little things funny that you remember. But anyways, we got into the hospital, and it was just a nightmare. She had swollen up so bad. I couldn't be with two of them, so Dad went with Derek. I went with Tori, and they couldn't get a catheter, and it was just a nightmare. But anyways, she was life-flighted down to the Ann Arbor burn and trauma unit. And I had Kevin and had to get some stuff because they said, you're going to be there a while. So my husband went in the airplane. My mom went with Derek in the ambulance, and they took him down to the burn and trauma unit. So it just so happened Dan took the keys in the plane, so I was locked in at the hospital for a long time until the police got there. But anyways, long story short, we got to the burn and trauma unit, and I'm not going to get into that, but it was a nightmare because her pain meds wouldn't take, Tori's didn't, because the chemo drugs or something. So every time they would do the scrubbing, she would just scream and ask me to please make them stop because she could feel anything. The hallucinatory drugs they give you, it didn't work for her, and it was just a nightmare. And so I couldn't be with Derek because he was in a different room, and someone always had to be with the child. So I just remember there was a motel attached to the hospital, and it was almost a mile. So Mom would bring Kevin to me, I would nurse him, and she would take him back, and then I would be with Tori, and Derek would be with Dad. And it was kind of like our family. We didn't hardly have a family anymore because it was traumatic. Insurance wasn't working. There was just a lot of stress. And then when we thought that things couldn't get worse, And actually, we didn't know if Tori would live because she had to go off all her chemo drugs, and they had just done the harshest chemo. Her pain meds weren't working. She stopped talking. She went into her mind and stopped responding. Kind of because I think she kind of lost her mind. And we couldn't get her to eat. It was just awful. And we got a phone call. And I remember I was sitting in the windowsill with Dan, and the phone rings, and the guy that he was working for said, I hate to share this with you now, but you no longer have a job because our company went bankrupt. And I just looked at him, and we almost had to laugh because, you know, you think, how can it get any worse? But it was the least of our problems at the time. So anyways, long story short, God did some miracles there because we were able to train the whole burn and trauma unit at the Ann Arbor University Hospital how to use a natural burn treatment, because typically speaking, she'd have had to have skin grafted over most of her body, and she wouldn't have been able to lay on the front or the back. So because of God's, I mean, who heard of a university hospital ever doing natural treatment? So you saw nurses carrying pans of, in bed pans, big burdock leaves, and they documented, took her case to Washington and won exemption for people to have a natural treatment because the nurses were crying because they said, we have to hold people down to scrub them and this is inhumane. So that was a victory. But we were there for about a month. She had to learn to walk again. The nurses would pay her to walk. Anyways, fast forward. So we got home and we were wrapping 2 children with this burdock leaves 12 hours around the clock. I had a nursing baby and we didn't know if she would live or die for a while. And you kind of just block it because the only way you can cope is to block. And so we blocked. And I didn't think, people would ask, how are you feeling? And you never had time to analyze because I felt if I ever would think how I feel, you know, you would never recover. So for a year, we didn't have work. And it was only through people loving on us, meeting our house payments, that we were able to even survive. So after a year of no work, my husband looked for odd jobs, but he had to be there because you had to wrap her whole body. It was like an 1.5-hour process, and wrap Derek every 12 hours. So I couldn't do it by myself and have a nursing baby. So, but he would do firewood, everything else. We got a call that said, do you want to come down to Kentucky? You can just have those like 2 weeks of work, and you can model how to do logging. He used to be into logging machinery. And so he said, yeah, we thought we'll just go down for 2 weeks. Well, the 2 weeks turned into, long story short, a 6-year point in time. And so we were looking for a house, and we couldn't find anything. And someone said, there's an Amish community, and they're looking for a naturopath doctor locally. Would you ever consider moving in there, and you could be their doctor? So we said, well, sure, because I mean, we were desperate for work. And so we moved to a community that totally changed our life. It was so amazing. The people loved on us, and it was an answer to prayer. And I remember when we moved in, that we hadn't even got the boxes in the house, and people were coming. And I remember opening up boxes to give them herbs because I hadn't unpacked my supply yet. And so that started, and it was such a blessing at one hand, and on the other hand, I started noticing little things in myself because we had to drive 3 hours to Louisville for Tori's treatments, and then insurance wouldn't pay for her burn garment, so we drove 6.5 hours to Shriners. And so we were driving a couple times a month, like nonstop. And so it was good to have these people. They were a blessing, but it was also I started noticing little things in myself. I had helped hundreds of people deal with anxiety. I helped people heal psychological issues, and I knew what was going on in my mind, but I just felt at the time overwhelmed to add trying to fix myself on top of what I already had on my plate. So I had people from 6 in the morning till 11 at night stopping in at my house. We were homeschooling. I had the children's situation there. And it was such a blessing because Dan was getting up at 4:30 to go to work. He had to drive an hour. He'd get home at 6:37. He'd do the chores. We had a farm. And I hardly see him because he had to get up so early. He'd crash in bed. And we basically were like ships passing in the night. But we did it because we had a whole year's worth of not having work. So anyways, for about a year, I had lots and lots and lots and lots of clients. My business was thriving. But I was going backhill fast, and nobody really knew it. I remember standing on top of our heater one day and just started hyperventilating. I couldn't breathe. I had to lean way back to even get a breath. There was times in bed, it took me 5 minutes till I could even really breathe. Like it was crushing. And people that have struggled with anxiety know what I'm talking about. And I didn't even want to go out into public anymore because half the time I just would have to stand in one spot, just to get a deep breath, and my heart would just pound. And I knew what it was. And I would tell Dan, I says, honey, I heal people like me, but I just cannot think of taking that on yet, to do what it takes to deal with this yet. And it started getting worse and worse. I remember if I would hear a buggy coming up my lane, I would hyperventilate. There was times I literally was in a brown paper bag, just praying, God, get it, help me, because I can't breathe. And it was getting worse and worse. And I started gaining weight. Thyroid runs on both sides of my family. And I know when someone has stress long enough, their thyroid will often start to be affected. And those of us that know me, we're super crunchy. We raised all our own meat in Kentucky, had all our own gardens. We did totally organic food. We fermented everything you can ferment, including things you probably shouldn't ferment. And our diet was 99% pure, and it was a good diet. And I started gaining weight, doing nothing different. I was eating less, and I kept gaining weight. And that year I gained, I think, 40 pounds, eating perfect. My hair started coming out in handfuls. I didn't even want to comb my hair anymore because I was going bald. My fingernails, I could peel them off. And at the same time, the anxiety kept getting worse and worse. And I remember one time my husband just made a suggestion. He says, why don't we have some friends over? And I literally fell to pieces. It took me probably an hour to even breathe normal. So I knew something was wrong, but it wasn't until we went to, I remember my husband took me out for a drive because Mom came and watched the kids, and I just was falling to pieces, and I felt like I was having a heart attack. And my chest hurt so bad I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was going numb, and I said, honey, I think I'm dying. And that was about the only thing that would have gotten me to the hospital. And so he took me into urgent care, and there was an older gentleman, and he was so calm and so nice, and he had my hand, and I wasn't even with it enough to realize he was taking my pulse. And he says, tell me what's going on. So I told him a little bit. I said, I just can't breathe. Like, I think of something. I couldn't go to church anymore or go anywhere in public, even to grocery shop, because it would just be too much. So he said, honey, you've been hyperventilating since you got in here. And I'm like, I'm going to put you in an antidepressant. I said, depressed? And I'm not depressed. I'm just so overwhelmed. I can't think straight. And I was like this the whole time. And he's like, you're having panic attacks. So he gave me a prescription, which I never filled. I said, there's no way I would do that, because I knew that wasn't going to fix anything. And that was a wake-up call for me. And so I knew something had to change because it was getting so bad at this point. So I've been watching posts on Facebook, a lot of friends that I had been seeing that had been healed of anxiety using some products. And I thought, there's no way, that's not going to work. But I was desperate. I was so desperate because I was losing my mind, kind of. And I couldn't be a decent mom. I couldn't be, what I was supposed to be with as bad as it was getting. And so, and I had gotten labs done. I knew my thyroid was so out of whack at this point. In fact, it hurt to swallow sometimes. It felt like I was swallowing my whole tongue. And I knew what it was. I was taking handfuls of supplements, therapeutic dose supplements that you have to have a license to sell. And I would probably take about 50 a day just to survive, of stress, anxiety, nerve supports, thyroid, everything, just to keep my mind, to get through the day. And so I started taking some supplements, plexus supplements, and I didn't expect anything because I already was taking so many of the top of the line nutrients. We were eating perfect, like you could not eat better. And I still was just surviving. So I started taking them, didn't expect a whole lot. I was taking them for a couple months. I didn't notice a big difference, but I had to laugh because my husband, one time, it was Friday night, and I had run out. He says, where's the Slim? And I had run out of it. And I told him I'd given it. Someone had stopped in, and so I sold it to him. And he said, he didn't say anything. But about 10 minutes later, I went to ask him for, I forget what it was. And the kid says, Daddy's not here. He went somewhere. And it was about 10 minutes later, he came back. He says, honey, here. He went and got it from a friend of ours in the community. He says, you do not have to go all weekend. You can have some right here. So I took it. And about 8 months in, I started noticing my anxiety that was crippling me before. it didn't hit. There was a situation that come out, and I remember looking out our living room, our bedroom window, and I says, honey, I didn't have a panic attack. I said, I can breathe. You know, I said, did you see how good I handled that situation? And he didn't say much wisely. He's like, yeah, honey, that's awesome. And it was about a year in, we went on a trip, and I forgot to take my other anti-anxiety and stuff that I had been living on, not drugs, natural things, but I forgot to take them with me. All I had was some of the Plexus products. And for that whole, I will forget, like 2 weeks or so, I never had a single anxiety attack. And I thought, something is changing. Something is really changing. And I went to Pennsylvania to share what I had, my story, not this in depth, but just share a little bit of what I had researched, because when I started noticing it was working, I took every single ingredient of every single supplement, and I spent over 1 month, I spent over 50 hours at night just reading and articles and cross-referencing. And the more I started studying, the more I realized why this was just healing. Because I jumped over a period of time. It had been about 3 years that this had been escalating with the anxiety and panic attacks. And in a short couple months, I started noticing a difference. And then it made such a life-changing difference in Tori. So dramatic. I heard stories online. I'm not going to get into that. That I knew something was here. And so as I went over every single ingredient and started looking, I realized I know why this is changing. I know why my thyroid levels are coming into balance. I know why my anxiety is coming down. It makes sense. And that is what truly got me into sharing Plexus. So March, I went down to Pennsylvania, and I had done some meetings there, and I came back in May. And I remember when I walked in the door in May, a friend of mine says, what did you do? Something has changed. She said, you look totally different. And I thought, you know what? There is something here. I have changed. And I went back and got blood work done. My thyroid levels were perfect. My anxiety by this point was 95% gone. Within about 5 to 6 more months, you guys, what I had struggled with that was literally crippling, that took my life from me, the panic attacks, the breathing into a bag, the inability to breathe, just reminded me of just like you had to lean back to get a breath, was gone. And that was a year ago. And since then, it's been interesting. God has brought so many people into my life. I'd worked with so many people before with the same thing, and that's why I knew what was happening. But God has brought so many people into my life with the same issues that I can truly say, I understand what you're going through. I know what it's like to feel that way, and it does not have to be that way. People do not have to live with anxiety. They do not have to live with depression or bipolar, manic, any of those issues. Your body is able to heal. It did not happen overnight. And that's the biggest thing I want to say to people. It did not happen overnight. This was a 16 to 20 month where my life changed. And so if I would have stopped 5, 6 months in, it wouldn't have changed. But because I understood what was happening, my body was able to heal itself of this issue completely. Both sides of my family, on both sides, most of my aunts and uncles struggle with it. And the anxiety that had crippled me, the panic attacks are gone. And so I can just say, thank you, Lord. Because sometimes I was unofficially diagnosed with PTSD, and I can see why. I couldn't even talk about some of the stuff I shared today for a couple of years. But I want to tell you, if this is something you're struggling with, it can be debilitating. For a while it was for me. I truly was incapable of functioning right. But it's no longer my story. Nothing of my circumstances changed. I still had the same circumstances. I still had people coming to my house from 6 in the morning to 11 at night. I still homeschooled 3 kids. I still was going to the burn and trauma unit in Shriners. I was going to the cancer clinic in Louisville. I had a young child. None of that changed. But these products truly, truly, truly changed my life. So when I share these products, I don't share because there's a company to push. I share it because it gave me my life back. If you ever wanted to know Tori's story, it changed her life with what she had gone through with cancer and burns and everything. And so what we have works, and that's why I share it. Hopefully, this was a little bit difficult for me. Hopefully, this touches someone's life.